January 1941. Night settles over an industrial city in Britain's Midlands. The blackout has already swallowed the streets, but the factories remain awake. Their windows are masked, their lights dimmed, yet the rhythm inside never stops. Steel presses strike. Conveyor belts move. Hands, mostly women's hands, guide metal into shape with practiced precision. The air begins to change before the sirens sound. A distant drone rolls in from the east, low and steady, growing heavier by the second. Searchlights cut upward, pale beams slicing through cloud and smoke. Then the warning comes. Long, rising, impossible to ignore. Above the city, German bombers release their payloads. Explosions tear through nearby neighborhoods. Glass shatters. Roofs collapse. The ground trembles beneath the factory floors. Inside, the machines continue. Women steady themselves as the shock waves ripple through the building. Some pause only long enough to check that the power still holds. Others wipe dust from their faces and return to their stations. Production lines slow, but they do not stop. From the air, German crews mark the fires and smoke. What they cannot see clearly, but will soon understand, is that the factories below are still working. And that realization, more than the bombs, will begin to change how this war is fought. The reasons this endurance mattered were rooted in decisions made long before that night. When the Second World War began in September 1939, German military planners believed they had already learned one of modern war's most decisive lessons. Wars were not won only at the front. They were won in factories, rail yards, power stations, and in the morale of civilian populations. Destroy those, and armies would eventually collapse on their own. This belief did not come from theory alone. During the Spanish Civil War, German aircraft of the Condor Legion had tested bombing tactics against cities such as Guernica. The destruction caused international outrage, but within German military circles, it also produced a conclusion. Air power could break civilian will. When Germany invaded Poland later that same year, Luftwaffe bombers struck not only military targets, but transportation hubs and urban centers. Polish resistance collapsed in weeks. Similar patterns followed in the Netherlands and France in the spring of 1940. Rotterdam's destruction, in particular, appeared to confirm the doctrine. A single, devastating raid had forced surrender. By the summer of 1940, Germany stood alone against Britain. Operation Celian, the planned invasion of the British Isles, depended entirely on removing the Royal Air Force and weakening Britain's ability to resist. The Luftwaffe was tasked with achieving air superiority and, if necessary, forcing political collapse through bombing. At first, German attacks focused on airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. But as losses mounted and RAF resistance held, targets began to widen. By September 1940, German strategy shifted decisively towards cities. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, and dozens of industrial centers came under sustained assault. The campaign became known as the Blitz. Night after night, bombers crossed the Channel, guided by radio beams and navigational lights, aiming not just to destroy infrastructure, but to exhaust the population psychologically. German intelligence assessments predicted that Britain's industrial output would decline rapidly. Civilian casualties, homelessness, and fear were expected to lead to absenteeism, strikes, and eventually unrest. Factories, it was assumed, would empty as workers fled or refused to continue under such conditions. What these assessments underestimated was the transformation already underway within British society. By 1940, Britain had begun mobilizing its entire population for total war. With hundreds of thousands of men conscripted into the armed forces, labor shortages threatened critical industries. The solution was controversial but unavoidable. Women would be brought into roles previously considered unsuitable or impossible for them. Government ministries reorganized labor on a national scale. The Ministry of Labor directed workers to essential industries. Training programs expanded rapidly. By the end of 1940, women were operating lathes, welding ship hulls, assembling aircraft frames, and filling shells with explosives. Many of these factories were the same ones now marked as priority targets by German bombers. Air raid precautions were integrated directly into industrial life. Factories built reinforced shelters beside production halls. Fire watchers were trained to extinguish incendiaries before they spread. Shifts were reorganized so that output could continue even after damage. In many cases, machines were simply moved to the side of the rubble and restarted. From the German perspective, the expectation remained that sustained pressure would eventually break this system. Reports from pilots described cities burning and neighborhoods flattened. Yet aerial photographs showed something puzzling. Smoke cleared, roofs were repaired, rail lines reopened, and production resumed with alarming speed. What German planners did not yet fully grasp was that the presence of women in these factories had altered the equation. The bombing campaign was no longer just striking buildings. It was testing a social transformation that had already taken root. As the attacks intensified, this transformation would become impossible to ignore, even from the air. By early 1941, the German bombing campaign had reached a scale unprecedented in British history. Entire districts of industrial cities were reduced to rubble. Yet the British war economy did not collapse. Instead, production figures revealed an uncomfortable reality for German planners. Output was holding steady, and in some sectors, even rising. This resilience was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate planning that treated civilian endurance as a strategic asset. British leaders understood that air power alone could not win a modern war unless it disrupted production faster than it could be repaired. To prevent this, the government reorganized industrial geography. Critical manufacturing was dispersed. Large plants were broken into smaller workshops. Some machinery was relocated to rural areas, tunnels, and improvised underground spaces. Even when a factory was hit directly, its function often survived. Women became the backbone of this system. By mid-1941, more than 2 million British women were employed in war industries. They worked long shifts under blackout conditions, often sleeping near their workplaces to avoid disrupted transport. Many arrived at their stations while fires still burned from the previous night's raid. Official reports noted that absenteeism after major bombings remained far lower than expected. German intelligence struggled to reconcile this with established doctrine. Intercepts and reconnaissance confirmed the scale of destruction, yet railway movements and supply flows continued. Ammunition deliveries to the front remained consistent. Aircraft losses were being replaced at a rate that surprised Luftwaffe planners. Factories identified as destroyed reappeared in operation weeks later. The psychological dimension of this failure was deeply troubling. German aircrews reported observing factory lights returning quickly after raids. In some cases, bombers returned to the same targets and found anti-aircraft defenses strengthened rather than weakened. The expected fear-induced paralysis did not materialize. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched these developments closely. Even before formally entering the war in December 1941, American industry began its own mobilization. Lessons from Britain were studied carefully. When the United States expanded war production, women again filled the gaps left by men sent overseas. Shipyards, aircraft plants, and munitions factories rapidly transformed. By 1943, American women were producing aircraft, tanks, and ships on a scale unmatched in history. For German soldiers and pilots encountering Allied forces later in the war, this industrial reality became increasingly evident. Captured equipment bore markings from factories bombed repeatedly. Aircraft numbers continued to grow despite massive air campaigns. Intelligence summaries began to acknowledge that bombing alone was insufficient to halt production, particularly when civilian labor was both motivated and protected by effective organization. The role of women in this endurance was not merely symbolic. They operated complex machinery, managed logistics, and enforced quality control under conditions of constant threat. Government and factory records show that accident rates declined over time, even during heavy bombing periods, as experience grew and procedures improved. Discipline and routine replaced panic. German assumptions about social breakdown under aerial bombardment have been shaped by earlier, shorter conflicts. Britain, and later the United States, demonstrated that a fully mobilized society could absorb punishment and adapt. The sight of women continuing to work amid ruins challenged deeply held beliefs about civilian vulnerability. By 1942, German strategic thinking began to shift. The failure to break Allied production forced a reassessment of air power's limits. Bombing could destroy buildings, but it could not easily erase skills, organization, or collective resolve. Understanding why this endurance proved so decisive requires examining the war from several angles at once. The endurance displayed inside bombed factories can be understood only by examining the war from multiple perspectives at once. The first is the human angle, quiet, persistent, and often overlooked amid statistics and battle maps. For the women working in British and later American factories, bombing raids were not abstract strategic events. They were lived experiences. Many began their shifts knowing their homes had been damaged or destroyed the night before. Others worked while family members served overseas, uncertain if letters would arrive or stop altogether. Yet factory records show that attendance often remained remarkably high even after the most destructive raids. This was not driven by propaganda alone, but by routine, responsibility, and the understanding that their labor directly sustained those fighting at the front. The second angle is tactical. German bombing accuracy, especially at night, was far more limited than pre-war planners had assumed. Navigation errors, weather, and anti-aircraft fire scattered bomb patterns. Industrial districts were hit, but rarely with the precision required to permanently disable production. Women working inside these facilities became part of the adaptation process. Machines were repaired quickly. Temporary workstations replaced destroyed ones. Output was redistributed across shifts and locations. The system bent, but did not break. A third angle is psychological. German doctrine relied on the belief that civilians would react to terror in predictable ways: fear, withdrawal, collapse. What German pilots observed instead unsettled them. Fires burned, yet movement continued below. Sirens sounded, but order returned quickly. Reports noted workers re-entering damaged buildings within hours. The expected silence after bombing did not come. Instead, activity resumed. This psychological resistance had measurable effects. British morale surveys conducted during the Blitz showed that fear peaked early but declined as people adapted. Familiarity reduced panic. Shelters, drills, and routines turned chaos into something manageable. Women in factories became central figures in this normalization. Their presence under fire reinforced the idea that work, not flight, was the correct response. The technological angle further complicates the picture. Industrial machinery was designed to withstand vibration and shock. Engineers modified layouts to reduce vulnerability. Electrical systems were segmented so that damage in one area would not shut down entire plants. Women trained on these systems became proficient at rapid restart procedures. Even after direct hits, partial production could resume quickly. From the air, German crews saw only fragments of this reality. Smoke and fire suggested destruction. But what lay beneath was a network designed for resilience. The visible damage did not reflect operational capacity. This disconnect fed confusion and frustration among Luftwaffe units tasked with measuring success. Finally, there is the strategic angle. Germany faced its own labor shortages as the war expanded. Male workers were conscripted. Skilled technicians were lost to the front. Allied bombing later inflicted similar pressures on German industry, but without an equivalent capacity to replace labor at scale early in the war. The contrast became stark as Allied production accelerated. Women working under bombardment were not simply enduring hardship. They were sustaining a strategic advantage. Every aircraft assembled, every shell filled, every vehicle repaired represented a failure of German expectations. The bombing campaign aimed to paralyze industry instead revealed its adaptability. Yet these realities looked very different when viewed through German eyes, shaped by doctrine, experience, and mounting losses. From the German perspective, the persistence of Allied production introduced a growing sense of unease that extended beyond statistics. It challenged assumptions embedded deep within military culture. Pre-war German doctrine had emphasized decisive blows, rapid collapse, and the psychological domination of the enemy. The sight, confirmed repeatedly by reconnaissance, of factories returning to life after bombardment conflicted with that worldview. German intelligence assessments from 1941 and 1942 increasingly acknowledged the limits of aerial destruction. Reports noted that industrial targets struck multiple times continued to function. In some cases, output dipped only briefly before returning to previous levels. The presence of women in these facilities was often mentioned in a matter-of-fact way, but the implication was clear. The labor pool was deeper, more flexible, and more resilient than anticipated. Leadership miscalculation forms another critical angle. Hermann Göring had assured political leaders that the Luftwaffe could break Britain through air power alone. When this failed, explanations shifted. Poor weather, inadequate bomber range, insufficient payloads. Rarely was the underlying assumption questioned, that civilian morale would collapse under pressure. Yet evidence increasingly contradicted this belief. Captured German aircrew later described surprise at the speed of repair and the continuity of production. Post-war interrogations reveal that many pilots had expected visible signs of economic paralysis. Instead, they encountered reinforced defenses, more aircraft, and sustained resistance. The bombing had not weakened the enemy. It had hardened it. There's also a moral angle that emerges from this period. Total war erased the traditional boundaries between front line and home front. Women working under falling bombs became participants in the conflict not by choice, but by necessity. Their continued labor blurred the distinction between civilian and combatant in strategic planning. German bombing campaigns increasingly targeted cities precisely because industry and population had merged. This shift carried profound ethical consequences that continue to be debated by historians. Another angle lies in comparison. When Allied bombing later targeted German industry, similar patterns emerged: repair, dispersal, adaptation. But Germany's earlier labor policies and ideological constraints limited the rapid integration of women into heavy industry at the same scale. By the time such measures expanded, Allied air superiority compounded the damage. The asymmetry became apparent. Fear among German soldiers and pilots did not always take the form of panic. It often appeared as quiet recognition. Recognition that the enemy could absorb punishment. Recognition that destruction did not equate to defeat. Recognition that the war would not be short. Letters from the front increasingly reflected this realization, noting the seemingly endless material resources of the Allies. Women continuing to work under bombardment became symbols of that endurance, not through speeches or slogans, but through consistency. Their presence meant factories reopened, supply lines flowed, and losses were replaced. For German observers, this consistency was unsettling. It suggested that no single blow, no matter how violent, would be enough. These angles converged toward a moment when German strategy began to shift, not because of one raid or one report, but because accumulated evidence made denial impossible. That moment would arrive as the bombing reached its most intense phase, and its limits became undeniable. By 1942, the air war over Europe had entered a new phase. The scale of destruction increased, but so did the clarity of its results. For Germany, the decisive question was no longer whether Allied cities could be damaged. They could, but whether that damage translated into lasting strategic effect. The answer was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. During the height of the Blitz, and later in the intensified bombing campaigns of 1942 and 1943, tonnage dropped on industrial centers reached levels previously thought sufficient to cripple production. Cities like Coventry had been devastated. Entire neighborhoods in Birmingham and Liverpool were flattened. Yet British aircraft output rose steadily. In 1940, Britain produced just over 15,000 military aircraft. By 1942, that number had doubled. By 1943, it surpassed 26,000. Behind those numbers were factories that refused to fall silent. German reconnaissance flights repeatedly photographed industrial districts showing signs of activity shortly after raids. Rail traffic resumed within days. Power stations were repaired. Temporary structures replaced destroyed buildings. In some cases, production was shifted to night shifts immediately following attacks. Women already trained and experienced filled these shifts in large numbers. The turning point was not marked by a single battle or announcement, but by a growing accumulation of contradictions. German bomb damage assessments predicted sharp declines in output that never fully appeared. Luftwaffe units reported rising Allied aircraft presence, even as bombing intensified. Each new wave of bombers was met by stronger defenses, not weaker ones. As the United States entered the war and expanded its own production, the contrast became even sharper. American factories, many employing women in unprecedented roles, operated beyond the reach of German bombers. The combined output of Britain and the United States began to overwhelm German capacity. By late 1942, Allied aircraft losses were being replaced faster than German ones. The balance of the air war was shifting. German soldiers encountering Allied material in North Africa and later in Italy noticed the same pattern. Equipment was abundant. Spare parts were available. Replacement vehicles appeared quickly. Intelligence officers traced serial numbers back to factories known to have been bombed. The implication was unsettling. Bombing had failed to sever the industrial lifeline. Within German leadership circles, discussions grew more sober. The assumption that civilian morale could be broken through air attack alone no longer aligned with observable reality. Reports acknowledged that labor participation, including female labor, remained high despite casualties and destruction. The expected collapse had not occurred. For German pilots, this realization carried personal weight. Missions flown at great risk produced damage that proved temporary. Losses mounted, while visible strategic progress remained elusive. Fear emerged not only from Allied defenses, but from the sense that their efforts could not decisively alter the course of the war. Women working under falling bombs had become an unanticipated factor in this equation. Their continued presence at machines meant that destruction translated into inconvenience rather than paralysis. The bombing campaign had revealed a critical truth. Industrial resilience was not solely a matter of steel and concrete, but of people willing to return after the smoke cleared. As this understanding spread, German strategy faced a reckoning that would reshape the air war itself. By early 1943, the cumulative evidence forced a strategic acknowledgement within German command structures. The bombing of Allied cities had failed to achieve its primary objective. Civilian morale had not collapsed. Industrial production had not been permanently disrupted. And critically, the workforce, now heavily composed of women, remained intact and motivated. This realization coincided with a reversal in the air war. Allied bombers began appearing over German cities in growing numbers. The same industrial logic Germany had once applied was now being turned against it. Yet there was a fundamental difference. The Allies had already proven that production could survive bombardment. Germany had not prepared its society in the same way. British and American strategic bombing doctrine emphasized sustained pressure combined with overwhelming output. Women continued to work in Allied factories even as German air raids diminished. Meanwhile, German cities faced increasingly destructive attacks. The contrast was stark. Where Allied production adapted early, German industry struggled to compensate for labor losses, material shortages, and disrupted transport. For German soldiers and pilots, fear took on a new form. It was no longer just fear of enemy fire, but fear of inevitability. Each Allied aircraft represented not only a weapon, but a failure of German strategy. The presence of women in Allied factories, documented in intelligence summaries and post-war reports, symbolized a depth of mobilization Germany could no longer match. The decisive moment came not with surrender, but with recognition. Recognition that air power alone could not win the war. Recognition that industrial endurance, supported by a fully mobilized population, had shifted the balance irreversibly. German planning increasingly focused on defensive measures rather than decisive strikes. Resources were diverted to air defense, shelters, and repairs, resources no longer available for offense. German aircrew memoirs written after the war often reflect this turning point. They describe the frustration of flying missions that produced spectacular destruction but no strategic collapse. They note the disbelief that factories could resume operation so quickly. Some recall seeing workers, women among them, moving through damaged sites shortly after raids, a sight that contradicted everything they had been taught to expect. By mid-1943, the war in the air had decisively turned against Germany. Allied production surged. Air superiority gradually passed to the Allies. The bombing campaign that once aimed to terrify now struggled merely to slow the inevitable. The continued labor of women under bombardment had not stopped bombs from falling, but it had stripped those bombs of their intended power. Fear, when met with organization and resolve, had failed to deliver victory. The consequences of this failure would shape the remainder of the war and its aftermath in profound ways. The aftermath of the Allied endurance under bombing campaigns revealed the full scale of miscalculations by German planners. Factories that German intelligence had assumed would be incapacitated were instead operating at near full capacity. The Midlands, the Northeast, and other industrial hubs had sustained heavy damage, yet production lines restarted with remarkable speed. Women, trained and experienced, were central to this recovery. Their labor filled gaps left by men conscripted to the front, ensured that repair crews worked efficiently, and maintained output even under the constant threat of attack. Air raid damage reports from this period provide clear evidence. For example, the Birmingham Small Arms Factory, despite being struck multiple times during the Blitz, resumed producing rifles and machine guns within days. Similarly, aircraft factories in the West Midlands repaired bombed hangars, relocated assembly lines, and maintained high output, enabling continuous supply to the Royal Air Force. These operational recoveries were not anomalies. They were repeated across dozens of sites in Britain. The psychological impact on German aircrews was profound. Pilots who had trained to instill fear and force surrender were confronted with evidence that destruction alone did not equate to defeat. Reconnaissance photos often showed smoke and fire, but activity never ceased. German intelligence acknowledged this quietly in internal memos. Enemy factories resume operation faster than predicted. Civilian labor, including women, maintains continuity of output. Strategically, this resilience had consequences far beyond individual factories. Aircraft losses inflicted on Germany's Luftwaffe over time were offset by the rapid production of Allied replacements. Tanks, munitions, and ships continued to arrive at front lines in unprecedented numbers. Allied forces were able to sustain campaigns in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and later Europe, largely because their industrial base proved impervious to sustained aerial assault. In addition, civil defense infrastructure and public organization complemented the work of these women. Fire brigades, first aid teams, and improvised repair crews allowed cities to absorb damage without collapse. While destruction was visible and terrifying from the air, operational continuity was preserved. Each night that factories remained active under attack became a lesson in resilience that German strategists could not ignore. The moral dimension of this endurance also emerged. German doctrine assumed terror would undermine civilian will. The reality was that civilians, particularly women, transformed fear into action. By maintaining production, they contributed directly to the war effort. This endurance reframed how total war was understood. It was not just a contest of armies, but a contest of society's ability to sustain themselves under fire. These observations would shape German strategic thinking, and increasingly, the Allies' confidence, as the industrial war proved as decisive as any battle on the front lines. The long-term consequences of this industrial resilience became evident by mid-1943. Allied forces, supplied continuously with aircraft, tanks, and munitions, gained the upper hand in multiple theaters of war. German strategies, which had relied on breaking civilian morale and halting production, were failing. The Luftwaffe's inability to decisively damage Allied industry forced a shift toward defensive operations, diverting aircraft, pilots, and resources away from offensive missions. Intelligence reports captured a growing awareness of this reality. The Abwehr and Luftwaffe summarized repeatedly that women's labor in factories ensured rapid repair and replacement of equipment. Factories bombed one night were operational within days, and in many cases, temporary production sites had already been established. German officers noted frustration at targeting dispersed, well-organized industrial zones. One post-war study concluded that the effectiveness of bombing was negated not merely by physical repair, but by human adaptability. Beyond the battlefield, these developments had profound implications for wartime policy. Governments recognized the value of total mobilization, including the integration of women into traditionally male-dominated industries. The success of these measures in Britain and the United States would inform post-war industrial planning and labor policy. It became clear that societal resilience, training, organization, and dedication was as strategically important as technological advantage. From a strategic standpoint, the failure to break production extended the war, providing time for the Allies to expand and modernize their forces. Aircraft replacement rates, tank production, and ammunition supplies continually outpaced German expectations. By the time Allied air campaigns intensified over continental Europe, Germany faced a technologically and numerically superior opponent, compounded by shortages and the inability to sustain prolonged aerial pressure on Allied industry. Post-war reports, memoirs, and archival studies highlight the symbolic importance of women working under bombardment. They were not merely contributing labor. They were embodiments of endurance, demonstrating that civilian populations could absorb destruction without capitulation. The visible continuation of factory operations became a psychological counterpoint to German expectations, fostering a sense of inevitability within the German command. The war could not be won by terror alone. Ultimately, the industrial and social resilience observed in Britain, reinforced by American production, reshaped the trajectory of the Second World War. The persistence of labor, especially women under fire, turned bombing campaigns into a test of endurance rather than a tool of immediate victory. German strategy faltered in the face of this adaptation, revealing the limits of aerial terror and highlighting the strategic power of organized, determined civilian populations. This endurance set the stage for the final stages of the conflict, where material supremacy and industrial capacity would prove decisive. The story of women continuing to work under falling bombs offers a lesson that extends beyond statistics and strategy. It reveals a truth about modern warfare. Victory is shaped as much by human resilience as by weapons and tactics. Factories, machines, and infrastructure are vital, but they are only as effective as the people who operate them. In Britain, and later in Allied nations, the willingness of women to endure danger, maintain focus, and sustain production became a decisive factor in the outcome of the war. This endurance also reshaped the understanding of total war. German planners had assumed that terror could paralyze a society, that destruction alone would compel surrender. The reality proved otherwise. When faced with relentless assault, communities adapted. Systems were reorganized. War continued. Civilians became active participants in national defense. The courage and discipline of these women transformed what could have been a campaign of fear into a demonstration of strategic futility for the attackers. Historically, their labor bridged the gap between production and combat. Aircraft continued to reach the skies, tanks rolled to front lines, and ammunition reached soldiers even under the shadow of bombs. The effectiveness of Allied bombing was undermined not by chance, but by the human element, determined, trained, and resilient. German pilots and commanders observed, documented, and ultimately could not ignore this reality. Beyond the battlefield, these experiences left a lasting impact on society. Women's contributions during the war laid foundations for future labor reforms and demonstrated the profound value of collective effort in the face of crisis. Strategically, it underscored a lesson military planners would carry into the future. Technology and bombs alone cannot win wars if the human component remains intact and determined. The endurance of women under bombardment stands as a quiet but powerful testament to the intersection of courage, duty, and strategy. It reminds us that the measure of a nation's strength is not only in its weapons, but in the resolve of its people. And sometimes, that resolve can terrify even the most confident adversary. The legacy of this resilience echoes far beyond the factories of the Blitz, shaping both the conduct of war and the understanding of human courage in the face of relentless adversity.